Hello everyone. This is the lecture to accompany Chapter 2 in your textbook. Please also carefully read Chapter 2, as there are many ideas and illustrations that will help you understand the material in this chapter, and I simply don't have time to discuss them in this lecture. Okay, let's learn how to recognize arguments. When we think about arguments, we generally think about getting into disagreements or maybe even fights with other people. However, the kind of arguments we will be looking at in this class are not quarrels or shouting matches, although sometimes they can be the basis for them. In critical thinking, an argument is simply a claim defended with reasons. So the definition you will need to know is, an argument is a group of statements, one or more of which is intended to prove or support another statement. Arguments are composed of at least one, but sometimes more, premises that lead to a conclusion. The premises are the statements that are offered to support the conclusion. Sometimes we call them reasons or evidence. And the conclusion is the statement that the premises support or prove. So I've used the word statement a couple of times here. You need to understand what a statement is as well. It's something you say that can be viewed as either true or false. How do you know if something is a statement? Well, does it make sense to put "it is true that" or "it is false that" in front of it? If so, it's a statement. So let's look at some examples of what statements are and what they are not. Red is a color. How can I tell that's a statement? I can say, "It is true that red is a color." It makes sense to do that, so it's a statement. I could even say, "It is false that red is a color." And even though that's obviously not the case, it still makes sense in the fact that I could say it and it would be a statement. The next example, you could either put "it is true that" or "it is false that" in front of it. So it is true that abortion is morally wrong, or it is false that abortion is morally wrong. It's a statement dealing with morality, so there's more room for argument there. And the Matrix example, The Matrix is a better movie than Titanic, which is an evaluative statement, and that means it's a matter of opinion and taste. So you could say, "It is true that The Matrix is a better movie than Titanic," or you could say, "It is false that The Matrix is a better movie than Titanic." Either way, you're making a statement. Then we have examples of things that are not considered statements. Questions where you are specifically asking for information are not considered statements because it doesn't make sense to put "it is true that" or "it is false that" in front of them. Commands where you're telling someone to do something don't qualify as statements. And exclamations where you simply have a response to something is not a statement. Sentences or utterances that do not assert or deny that something is the case are not statements. As you can see here, some sentences express more than one statement, as in "roses are red and violets are blue." The first statement is "roses are red," and the second statement is "violets are blue." Also, some sentences are complete arguments in and of themselves, as the example here. With mortgage rates at 30-year lows, you owe it to yourself to consider refinancing your home. The premise of the argument is the first part of the sentence, the evidence or reason. With mortgage rates at 30-year lows, that leads us to the conclusion. You owe it to yourself to consider refinancing your home. If this isn't quite clear to you yet, don't worry. You'll get the hang of it. Okay, before we move on, I just want to clear a few things up about statements. There are a couple of tricky statements that look like something else, but are actually statements. For instance, rhetorical questions are usually statements, not real questions. Real questions or direct questions are ones in which you are asking for information. But rhetorical questions are statements disguised as questions to get the intended listener to think about something. Here's an example. "Don't you know that smoking will kill you?" If you say that to someone, of course you know that they know that smoking is dangerous. What you're really saying is, "It is true that smoking will kill you," and that is a statement. Then sometimes what sounds like a command is actually a statement. These are called ought imperatives. Ought imperatives are statements in the form of a command, but it's not an order. It's more like telling someone what they should or shouldn't do. And anytime you do that, It's a statement. Sometimes when you say do X, you really are making a command, and that's not a statement. But sometimes when you're saying do X, what you're really saying is you should do X. Don't blow dry your hair in the tub usually means you really shouldn't blow dry your hair in the tub, and that makes it a statement. So how can you tell if some questions or commands are actually statements? Well, context is key. So what is the reason for this utterance? If you can obviously tell that a person is asking a question for the purpose of getting information, or making a command for the purpose of getting something to happen, then that's not a statement. If a question isn't about getting information, but rather getting you to believe or think something about a particular thing, or a command is intended as advice, suggestion, or what you ought to do, then those things are statements. Okay, so let's do a little review here. Let's look together and decide whether each of these things is a statement or a non-statement. Number 1, capital punishment is wrong. Can you put it is true that or it is false that in front of it and have it make sense? Yes, you can. So it is a statement. The second one, what do you say we stop at the next rest stop? It's a question, but it's not a rhetorical one. You're trying to get information from another person. So it's not a statement. Number 3, I hope Peter likes his new job. Well, this might be a little tricky, but yes, it is a statement because it makes sense to put, it's true that I hope Peter likes his new job. You could even put, it is false that I hope Peter likes his new job if you're lying. Either way, it makes sense, so that is a statement. Number 4, what a crock of crap. Sounds like an exclamation, but it's actually a statement because it's another way of saying it is true that this is a crock of crap. Number 5, please print your name legibly is a request. It's not an odd imperative. You're not saying you really should print your name legibly. Even though there's a please in front of it, it is a command. So it's not a statement. Number 6, yikes. Yikes is an exclamation, not a statement. And number 7, this is actually an entire argument, and it has the ought imperative in it. The premise is ibuprofen and other pain relievers can cause stomach bleeding in people who drink alcohol. The conclusion is, therefore, people who consume more than 3 alcoholic beverages per day should ask their doctor whether they should take them. I don't know if you can see that, but that's exactly what it is. It's an argument because it has the premise, which is the reason for doing it. These things can cause stomach bleeding, and the conclusion. So you should ask your doctor before taking them. There are ways to tell the different parts of an argument from each other. One of these ways is by using what are called indicator words. Indicator words are words that give you clues that either a premise or a conclusion is being put forward. If statements contain indicator words, they are called explicit claims because they come right out and let you know what they are. There are some words that are specifically premise indicators. Words like since, seeing that, inasmuch as, in view of the fact, because, given that. These are typical premise indicators. There are also some words that hint at the conclusion. These indicator words are things like therefore, hence, so, it follows that, wherefore, thus, and consequently. Let's look at some examples of indicator words. The first example has a premise indicator word in it, because. So that part of the argument in that sentence is the premise. The second half of the sentence, it is time for us to build a light rail system, is the conclusion. The second one is a paragraph, but it's still a complete argument. The indicator word indicates the conclusion, the word therefore. Therefore, it would be in everyone's best interest to reform our welfare system to help the families of these children. So the other sentences in here are likely premises. Too many children are living in poverty. That's one reason we should reform the welfare system. The next reason is these children are far more likely than children from wealthier families to grow up and commit crimes. That's another reason we should reform the welfare system. So there are 2 premises and a conclusion. Okay, so those arguments were actually kind of easy to figure out because they had indicator words. But what if the argument doesn't contain any indicator words? Implicit claims are statements that have a relationship to the argument, but they don't use indicator words, so you'll need to figure out which is the premise or premises and which is the conclusion. And generally speaking, you do this by searching for the conclusion. How do you do that? Well, here are some tips. First, look for the main issues. What is the author trying to get you to think? It might be obvious. If you can figure out the main idea the author is trying to get you to believe, then that's probably the conclusion. Another thing you could do is look at the beginning statement and the ending statement in this argument. Much of the time, that is where you'll find the conclusion. See which of the statements in the argument the word therefore best fits in front of, because that's a typical conclusion indicator. And you can also use what's called the because trick. The because trick is where you fill in the blanks of this sentence. The arguer believes blank because blank. So the arguer believes the conclusion because of the premises. And that's how you can tell. Here's a bit of a complex argument. Actually, it's not really complex, but when you're just learning argument, it probably is. So here's an example of what I'm talking about. There aren't any indicator words used in this paragraph to help you identify which of these statements is the conclusion. But if you look for the main thing the author is trying to get you to believe, look at the first sentence and the last sentence, and use the because trick, you can probably figure out that, in this case, the first sentence is the conclusion, and all the other sentences are premises, which are the reasons or evidence that the arguer uses to come to that conclusion. He's really saying that because fertile agricultural lands are unusable and uninhabitable, and because grazing of livestock is extremely dangerous under these circumstances, and because it's very difficult for refugees to go back to their towns and villages under these circumstances, that, the conclusion, the indiscriminate use of landmines in rural areas has devastated many El Salvadoran communities. Even though it's the first sentence in the argument, it's the main idea he wants to get across to his audience, so it's the conclusion. So we've talked about what is and isn't a statement. Let's talk about what is and isn't an argument. Remember, an argument is composed of one or more premises and a conclusion. But how do we distinguish arguments from non-arguments? The basic test is this. It's an argument if it's a group of two or more statements, and one of those statements is designed to be proven or supported by the other statements. Let's look at a couple of things that are sometimes confused with arguments but are not arguments. First, reports. These are statements that are used simply to convey information, not to convince someone of something. If the purpose of the discourse is to report, narrate, or inform, it's not an argument. In these examples, the authors are simply telling us what happened. More people moved to the South this year. Oil prices dropped today, and so did gas prices. These are all statements, but they are not arguments. Second, unsupported assumptions or claims. These are statements about what someone happens to believe, maybe their opinion of something. If there's no evidence or they don't provide any evidence to back it up, they're just making a claim about what they think is true. It's not an argument. This isn't to say that people haven't gotten into arguments over this, and I'm talking about the other kind of argument, but they are not offering an argument. The first example, people aren't afraid of dying, they're afraid of not living. That's a philosophical platitude. It sounds deep, but there's no evidence presented, so it's not an argument. The second one, maybe you think it's true. Everybody wants to get married someday. A lot of people do think that, but without providing any evidence to support it, it's just an assumption. Finally, the claim about millions of people voting illegally has been stated many times and is actually believed to be true by many. But usually when people put this forward as a claim, they never provide any information. They just say, this is what I think. And if they did, that would actually be an argument. But like I said, they generally don't. Another thing that's not an argument is a conditional statement. Conditional statements are also known as if-then statements, and they are not arguments. They are statements that say if one thing occurs, then something else will occur, and they're made up of two basic parts: the antecedent, or the part that follows if, and the consequent, or the part that follows then. So here's an example. If it rains, then the picnic will be canceled. In this example, if it rains is the antecedent. Then the picnic will be canceled is the consequent. Now, sometimes conditionals don't use the words if or then, but if you can restate the statement to put them in and it still makes sense, it's a conditional. So the statement, in the event of rain, the picnic will be canceled, does not have either if or then in it, but you can easily restate that as if it rains, then the picnic will be canceled. So it is a conditional statement, and again, not an argument. Remember, conditional statements are not arguments. There's no claim that follows from another claim. You're not providing evidence that leads to a conclusion. For instance, this first example in the conditional statement, if I was taller, I could play basketball. If I was taller being the antecedent, I could play basketball as the consequent. It isn't asserting that they could play basketball. What they're saying is that if the first statement were true, the second statement would be true. And they're certainly not asserting that they are taller. They're saying that if they were taller. So it's not an argument. To make an argument out of that topic, it would have to be something like, I am tall, so I would make a good basketball player. The I am tall part is the premise, the evidence, that leads to the conclusion that I would make a good basketball player. The second example, if Rhode Island was larger than Ohio and Ohio was larger than Texas, then Rhode Island would be larger than Texas, is still a conditional statement because it's saying if the first two things are true, then the third thing is true. Here's where it gets a little tricky, and I'm not trying to confuse you, but you do need to know that conditional statements are often a part of an argument. Even though conditional statements are not arguments in and of themselves, if you link them together to come to a conclusion, then they can be part of an argument. That is called a chain argument, and it usually looks something like this. If A, then B. If B, then C. Therefore, if A, then C. So here's an example. If Bob is taller than Chris, that's A, then Bob is taller than Ann, that's B. And you take B, if Bob is taller than Ann, then Bob is taller than Lori. That's C. So now you're coming to the conclusion based on those two things. Thus, if Bob is taller than Chris, which is A, then Bob is taller than Lori, which is C. This is an argument because you're using the first two conditional statements as premises to come to the conclusion in the final statement. Okay, there are a couple more things that are often confused with arguments. Illustrations. Illustrations are used to provide examples for a claim, not as evidence that the claim is true, just to explain what you mean in a bit more detail. So in this example, many wildflowers are edible. For example, daisies and daylilies are delicious in salads. Now, the person is not using daisies and daylilies as proof that wildflowers are edible. All they're doing is providing a couple of examples to help you understand what they're talking about. You do have to be careful, though, because sometimes it's hard to distinguish illustrations from actual evidence. For one thing, the phrases for example and for instance are often used before giving actual evidence. You really have to look at what occurs after those phrases to determine whether you're looking at evidence, something that proves a point that someone's trying to make, or an illustration, something that just makes it easier to understand. Sometimes it's a bit of a gray area, and in those cases it's best to assume that the author is simply illustrating the claim. Explanations are like reports and illustrations in the sense that they're simply giving information. In this case, usually as to why something occurred. Usually they're offered up to explain something that's already accepted as true. So here's some examples. The Titanic sank because it struck an iceberg. That's an explanation. They're not trying to prove that the Titanic sank. What they're saying is it sank and here's why. The next example here, capital punishment is wrong because it is murder. Now that is an argument because you're using the premise of it is murder to prove that capital punishment is wrong. So that is an argument. Now when it's an explanation, you've got two parts. The explanandum, what is explained, the thing that you're explaining, and the explanans, the explanation or the cause. So it's explanatum because explanans. So here is another example of what I'm talking about. The statement, I ski because I think it's fun, isn't an argument because I'm explaining why I like to ski, not because I'm trying to convince you that that's the reason why I ski, just to explain myself. You should ski because it's fun is an argument, because the it is fun part is evidence that leads to the conclusion you should ski. Hopefully you can see the difference here. But if you're not sure whether something is an argument or an explanation, you can put the statements to a couple of different tests. The first one is the common knowledge test. If a topic is about something that's considered common knowledge, it's probably an explanation, as most people don't argue over things that people generally believe to be true. So here's an example. The moon appears to rise and set in our sky because it's actually revolving around the earth. That's an explanation of why it rises and sets in the sky. Or the past event test. If it's talking about something that's past, it's probably an explanation because people don't generally argue that X occurred. So the example, the U.S. entered World War II largely because of Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. But that's a somewhat simplistic explanation, but it's still an explanation and not an argument. Another test is the author's intent test. Simply look at the statement the person is saying and ask yourself, are they trying to prove something or are they just trying to explain something to make it more understandable? In this example, Susan wants a college degree because she wants a better life. The person's not trying to prove that Susan wants a college degree. The person is explaining why Susan wants a college degree. And finally, the principle of charity. And this is something that can really help us in all our dealings with the ideas and arguments of other people. In life, we tend to get into arguments, the other kind of arguments, where no argument was intended, simply because we disagree with the content of what someone is saying. The principle of charity says that we should interpret generously. In other words, cut people a break when they throw out what you think is a bad argument. Maybe they're not trying to argue. They're not trying to convince you of anything at all. They're just trying to explain themselves. So, using the principle of charity in these cases where you chalk up the speaker's statements to an explanation of why they think or probably feel the way they do, rather than a bad argument, might save your friendship or make Thanksgiving dinner with your family more bearable. All right. This is the end of the lecture on Chapter 2.